Juliet, and today I'm going to answer the question, should everyone with type 2 diabetes go on a low carb or keto diet? So these low carb keto diets are all the rage at the moment, and really this is just my take on it, because I think that we sometimes get a little bit overly excited about these things that come up, and they show some promise, and people will do it without fully understanding what the potential risks and benefits are, and it may be appropriate or more appropriate in certain people than others, and what the alternatives are. So this is really to help you understand what is actually going on when you are on a low carb diet, what are the other things we need to consider, how you might go about it if you are going to do it, and that sort of thing. So you are then more informed and you can make that informed decision. Okay, so basically all the cells in your body will run off two different fuel sources. So we have two fuel sources available, and that is your glucose, which comes from carbohydrates. So this is a single sugar molecule, and fats, which come from fat. Now, if you think of it like a hybrid car, so you've got a hybrid car that can run off electricity, and it can also run off petrol. So glucose is like the electricity, and the fat is like the petrol. So the hybrid car will preferentially use the electricity. So when your battery's full, it will use up the electricity first, and when it needs to, it can switch over and use the petrol, which is like us. So our bodies and our body and our cells will preferentially use glucose for fuel when it's available, but when it is low, then it will switch over and use more fat for fuel. So I guess if you think about it, if you're constantly snacking, you're constantly topping up your battery, you're constantly topping up your battery, so you've got glucose available, which means that you're less likely to use up some of that fat for energy. So then if we take a step back for a minute and think or consider what is actually causing the insulin resistance in the first place. If you don't fully understand what insulin resistance is, I'm not going to be going into that in detail, and I recommend you go and watch some of my other videos first. But basically, insulin resistance is what is one of the first manifestations in people with type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is a big spectrum, and there's lots of heterogeneity. Everyone is slightly different in terms of what is predominantly driving it. But for a majority of people with type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, two of the key drivers, there are lots of drivers of insulin resistance, but two of the key drivers are fat and inflammation. So the fat can come from different sources. So fat can either come from dietary fat, but in particular from saturated fat. So when you start getting fatty buildup in the cells, it basically says the cell will signal that it doesn't need any glucose. Because it has lots of fat in the cells, it doesn't need glucose for fuel. So it's got enough energy in the form of fat, so it really doesn't need glucose, and that's what can contribute to insulin resistance. So the fat can come from dietary fat, as I said, predominantly saturated fat, because the saturated fat is more stable and it's more likely to be stored for energy rather than to be used for things like hormones and cell structures, which the unsaturated fats are more likely to be used for. So saturated fat comes predominantly from your animal products, so meat, dairy, eggs, poultry, and so forth. But then fat can also come from excess carbohydrates. So when you consume carbohydrates, which break down into glucose, you can store, you'll use up some of the glucose for energy, but we tend to have some left over. So you can store glucose as glycogen, and you can store approximately 100 grams in your liver. And then you can store glycogen in your muscles, and anywhere from 400 to 500 grams. Now, once these stores are full, so glycogen is basically the glucose storage molecule. So when you store glucose, you can store it as glycogen. So then when you need that energy, if you're going for a run, for example, then you will use that glycogen, you'll turn it back into glucose and use it for energy. So you'll store a bit of glycogen in your muscles and your liver. Then once these stores are full, and if you have excess glucose from eating more carbohydrate than you need, then that glucose will get converted in the liver to fat. So this fat can come from dietary fat, or it can come from excess carbohydrates, and then it can also come from just excess calories in general, because if you're eating more food than you need, then this will eventually get converted into fat and it will get stored in the body, and that can contribute to this fatty buildup in your cells. So it's this fat predominantly that contributes to inflammation. So that can come from not just sugar or carbohydrates, not just dietary fat, but it can come from just excess food in general. And then inflammation. So inflammation can arise from a number of different factors, but one of the main ones that happens inside the cell, which can contribute to this insulin resistance, is when we start getting stressed out mitochondria. So mitochondria is this little organ here that lives in the cells. Now this is not to size. Mitochondria are a lot smaller than that, and you have lots of little mitochondria all throughout the cells. I've just drawn it bigger so we can see it. So the mitochondria is the energy powerhouse. So basically the mitochondria is where all the action happens. This is where the glucose and the fat is converted into energy, and this energy is then what the cell can use to function and survive. So these mitochondria are really, really important. Without them, the cell would not be able to convert the glucose and the fat into this energy source that it can use. So for draw, glucose and fat are both converted into ATP in the mitochondria. So ATP is basically the energy currency of the cell, or the energy currency of the body. So ATP is just energy. So the fat and the glucose are converted in the mitochondria to energy. Now, when there is a stress on the mitochondria because there's too much glucose and too much fat, the mitochondria become stressed out, and that can lead to an increase in free radicals and inflammation. And I suggest you go and look at go and watch my mitochondria dysfunction video, which will go into this in a lot more detail. So I'm just touching on it today. So it's this inflammation and fatty buildup in the cells, which are really the main drivers for insulin resistance. Now, there are lots of things that can contribute to both of these, but when we're just talking about diet today, we'll kind of keep it at that. So people with type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, they have a degree of mitochondrial dysfunction, which means that their mitochondria have been under stress, and people with diabetes and insulin resistant tend to have less mitochondria, so they have less of the ability to turn this glucose and fat into energy, and they tend to have smaller mitochondria. So first of all, there's this mitochondrial dysfunction, and people with type 2 diabetes also tend to be metabolically inflexible, which basically means that they're not very good at switching between the two fuel sources. So they're not very good at switching between glucose and fat when they need to. And they're generally not very good or not very efficient at burning either of them, but they can't switch in between very easily. And we want to be metabolically flexible. So we want our cells to be able to switch between the two. So these are sort of the underlying causes or the underlying drivers of this insulin resistance. Now, when you are consuming carbohydrates, you are topping up your battery so that you are going to be preferentially using glucose for fuel. And as I said, if you've got extra, you'll store it in your muscles, and if you've got excess, that's when you store it as fat, and that's when it can be that's when we can start running into problems if we've got too much on board. If you stop eating carbohydrates, then you will burn up or use up your stored glycogen. So you'll use up the glycogen in your liver and your muscles, and it usually takes somewhere between 8 to 12 hours for you to use up those stores. Once you've used up those stores, that's when you start turning to fat for fuel. Now, if you're consuming too much glucose and too much fat all at once, this, as I said, puts too much pressure on the mitochondria, and it can lead to this metabolic meltdown, and you become very metabolically inflexible, which is generally what kind of drives this insulin resistance in the first place. So when you are consuming a low carb diet, you will switch to burn fat. Now, if you're consuming a low carb keto diet, you're not actually addressing the insulin resistance. So you actually become more insulin resistant when you are consuming a predominantly some keto diet. And that is because you are consuming a lot of fat. So the cells, you're still running off fat. So your cells are still going to have that fat in there. And when the cell is full of fat, it sends a signal saying, we are full of fat, we don't need glucose because we've got enough energy in here. So it actually makes you more insulin resistant. And if you think about it, it sort of makes sense as well, because all your cells, they can store or make a small amount of glucose if they need. Not all of them can make it, but most of them can store glucose. Your brain cells are the only ones that cannot store glucose. So they need a constant supply. So if you're not consuming carbohydrates and you're having to make all the glucose that your body needs, then you're becoming more insulin resistant, particularly, your muscles, for example, so that glucose, the small amount that's there, is reserved for the brain, because the brain can't store glucose and it needs a constant supply, and it uses up a very large amount of glucose in regards. It's a very small proportion of your body, but it uses up a large amount of glucose. So when you're only consuming fats, or when you're really consuming a large amount of fat and a small amount of carbohydrates, then it's almost like an adaptation that your body's going into to make sure that the glucose isn't taken up by other cells and it's sent to the brain. Okay, so that is one aspect of it. So a low carb keto diet isn't making you more insulin sensitive, it's actually making you more insulin resistant. And if you're consuming a lot of animal products, which most people on a keto diet are, then there are a number of other factors that we're bringing into the picture that will also contribute to insulin resistance. And they are, so, I mean, we're bringing in more saturated fat. Then there's heme iron. Advanced glycated end products, which I'll explain what they are, and environmental chemicals. So animal products we know are high in saturated fat. So if you're consuming a diet that is really high in saturated fat, you're going to get these fats building up in your cells because they are more likely to be stored as energy. Then you've got heme iron. So heme iron is a type of iron that you get from animal products, and it is very inflammatory. So it's pro-inflammatory. So heme iron can contribute to inflammation, and because it can contribute to this inflammation, it can also contribute to insulin resistance. And advanced glycated end products are basically formed when you cook meat or cook animal protein. So particularly when you cook at high and dry heats, it can form these advanced glycated end products, which can also contribute to inflammation and insulin resistance. And then environmental chemicals, and these are predominantly the fat soluble ones. So these are chemicals in our environment from various sources that accumulate in fat, and they can accumulate as you go up the food chain. So animals over the period of their life will accumulate these environmental chemicals. They will hide out in the animal's fat, and then when we eat the animals, we take on all those environmental chemicals and we store them in our fat. So then, because we're at the top of the food chain, we are more likely to be exposed to a larger number of these. So these are a number of factors, and so these environmental chemicals are in fat cells, or they can get into the cells, and they can also contribute to insulin resistance, inflammation and insulin resistance. So if you're doing a keto diet and you're eating a lot of animal products, you just need to be mindful of these other factors that you're bringing into the picture. All right, and so when you're on a keto diet, I mean, low carb is a big spectrum. So if we're talking more about a keto diet where you're really, really restricting carbohydrates to no more than 30 to 50 grams a day, you are actually, as I said, making yourself more insulin resistant, which means that you're more metabolically inflexible. So you're not going to be very good at switching back and forth between the two fuel sources. You will be predominantly burning fat. And if you do happen to eat any carbohydrates or glucose, you will notice that your blood sugars will shoot up. So you are much more glucose intolerant because your cells are full of fat, and the cells are ignoring insulin because they're saying, we've got enough fat in our cells, we're used to this now, we're running off fat, we don't need you. Then when you do eat carbohydrates, your blood sugars will go through the roof. And then people who are really set on this keto diet think that, look, when I eat any sort of sugar or carbohydrate, my sugars just go through the roof. They're the enemy, I don't want to touch them. And that's because you've actually made the insulin resistance more extreme in the background. Okay, so yes, when you're on a keto diet or when you're really restricting your carbohydrates, your blood sugars will look good because you're not eating carbohydrates, you're not having that, ingesting the glucose, so your blood sugars after a meal are not going to be going up. So you're not going to get these peaks and troughs. And yes, this is a good thing, because we don't want peaks and troughs, because when your blood sugars spike, that's when we can, they can be damaging and can cause problems, inflammation, and things in itself. So we don't want those spikes, but it makes sense that if you're not eating carbohydrates, you're not going to get those spikes. The trouble is, because you have created this state of insulin resistance, over time, people will start to notice that their fasting blood sugars start to creep up. So they are the first blood sugar reading you do in the morning before you eat anything. And that is because the insulin resistance is getting worse, and particularly in your liver. So as your liver starts to become more insulin resistant, your fasting blood sugars will start to go up. So we have to be mindful of that. And that's, a lot of people start to ask the question, I'm on this keto diet, I'm not eating any carbohydrates, and my fasting blood sugars, which should be the lowest of all my blood sugars, because I haven't eaten for all this time because I've been asleep, why are my fasting blood sugars high? And they can't quite work it out. And that really is why. And you also need to be mindful, if you are on a keto diet and you are eating a lot of animal products, we also need to be careful of your cholesterol, because we don't want your cholesterol going too high, your LDL cholesterol. Now, not all LDL cholesterol is created equal, and I recommend you go and watch my video on cholesterol so you have a better understanding of that. But in people with type 2 diabetes, we do need to be very careful, because you're at much greater risk of having a heart attack and cardiovascular disease. So we need to keep your cholesterol down, your LDL cholesterol. So that is another thing to look out for. Now, people who are on a low carb keto diet will tend to lose weight, and some people will lose quite a lot of weight. So they'll have quite a dramatic weight loss. There are a number of reasons for that. Now, most people lose a lot of weight because they're actually consuming less calories. The high fat and protein as well, but mostly the high fat content of the diet will actually suppress your appetite. So it's not so much that you're eating more fat and it's the fat that is making you lose weight. It's more because your appetite is suppressed, so you're eating less calories, and that is actually what's causing you to lose weight. So really, any diet where you're restricting calories will lead to weight loss. It's just because your appetite is suppressed. People find it a lot easier to do a keto diet or to follow a low carb keto diet because they're not feeling hungry. So it's much easier to just not eat. Okay, so most people will lose some amount of weight on a low carb diet, and the ones who see the most dramatic results are usually the ones who were eating a lot of processed and refined carbohydrates to begin with. And when you're going on a low carb diet, you realize how many foods contain carbohydrates, and that suddenly eliminates your bread, your chips, your chocolate, your ice cream, your lollies, your drinks, all sorts of things. So when you're eliminating all of those, then these people are they tend to see really, really, dramatic results. The other issue or thing we need to be mindful of with the low carb diet is, because some people lose so much weight all at once, I generally don't think it's a good thing to lose too much weight, too much fat all at once in a short period of time. And part of the reason, apart from it being a bit of a stress on your liver and your bile duct, you are releasing some of these environmental chemicals. So when you're losing a lot of fat, when you're breaking down a lot of these fat cells, you're also releasing a lot of these environmental chemicals into your blood. And this can then lead to quite high levels of these toxins, and they can also, they then have to go to your liver and be processed, and then that's putting a lot of strain on your liver, and we really want to be protecting and looking after the liver. So actually losing a whole lot of weight in a short period of time is not ideal. Okay, so that is another aspect to consider. Another aspect to consider, with the weight loss as well, most people who are going keto, when you start losing, when you're getting rid of your glycogen stores, glycogen molecules hold on to a lot of water. So for every glycogen molecule, you hold on to, I think, about 4 water molecules. So when you are going keto, you're getting rid of your glycogen, you're also losing a lot of water. So that initial weight loss, a lot of it is actually water that you're losing. Okay, so the other thing to be mindful of if you're on a low carb keto diet, more so this keto diet where you're really restricting your carbohydrates, a lot of people are not getting enough fiber, and fiber is really a super nutrient. It is so important that we are getting enough fiber. Fiber is important for a whole range of reasons. In particular, it's really important for your gut microbiome or your gut health. So your gut microbiome are a community of microbes that live in your gut. And we are now learning in the last sort of decade or so, there's been an absolute ton of research because we're realizing that most diseases actually start in the gut. And your gut is actually your largest immune organ. And your immune system is really important for regulating inflammation. So we need to make sure that your gut health is good to help regulate this inflammation, to keep inflammation down. And if you're not getting enough fiber, because fiber is basically food for those microbes in your gut. So they really nourish your gut. And when they eat their fiber, they ferment it and they produce these molecules, these anti-inflammatory molecules. So fiber will help to reduce inflammation, not just in your gut, but it will also help to reduce inflammation in your body, and it also has a positive effect on your insulin sensitivity. So not only is it important for your gut health and for inflammation and preventing many other diseases, it can also affect the way you absorb glucose, absorb and metabolize glucose, as well as fat. So if you have a really healthy, robust gut microbiome, you're less likely to absorb all of the sugar and all of the fat, and you're not going to absorb it all at once, so you don't get this big flood of glucose and fat that your mitochondria then have to deal with. Whereas if you're eating a lot of processed foods, that can affect your gut microbiome. But if you're on a low carb keto diet and you're not getting enough fiber, your gut can really suffer, and that can end up leading to a disproportionate amount of glucose being absorbed, and so it can affect your blood sugars in that sense. The other thing I guess we also need to be mindful of is looking long term. And if you are doing a keto diet and you are eating a lot of animal products, then really what the evidence says, or what the evidence is showing from really large epidemiological studies, but just from a whole range of different studies, the evidence is showing that people who have the highest consumption of animal products in their diet have a higher risk of premature death and cancer, cardiovascular disease, and things like this. So if you're wanting to do a keto diet in the long term, you really just need to be mindful of this. Which then leads me into what an alternative could be. So I personally think the best type of diet for someone with type 2 diabetes, and it's not a one size fits all, so everyone is going to be different, but I think for a majority of the people with type 2 diabetes, the best kind of diet or eating pattern is a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. Big mouthful. So basically that is a diet that is predominantly from plants, which means lots of vegetables, legumes, beans, nuts, seeds, some whole grains, some fruit, herbs and spices and so forth. Minimally processed, so mostly food that has not been adulterated by humans, by man, and then low fat, so minimizing overall fat intake, but in particular you're also not getting a lot of the saturated fat because you're predominantly having plants, you're eating less or no animal products, so you're not getting that saturated fat. I personally think, and not just thinking after all the research that I've done and all the studies that I've looked at, this is really the ultimate diet for longevity. So while the keto low carb diet can lead to really good short-term results, I personally don't think it is the best diet for the long term. So everyone will, I guess, find that they get different results on the two different diets. And the low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet is particularly beneficial. So I guess it works in a different way, because with the low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet, you're not consuming many dietary fats. So we're removing that source of fat, which means that your body then has a chance to use up the fat in those cells. So you slowly, provided that you're not over-consuming calories and over-consuming carbohydrates that end up getting turned to fat anyway, but it means that your cell can start to use up some of the fat, and it starts to help, you start to notice your insulin sensitivity improves, you start to become more metabolically flexible because you're able to use the glucose for fuel, but you're also able to switch over to the fat. And many of the phytonutrients and antioxidants that are in a whole food plant-based diet will also help to reduce inflammation, which again is going to help with insulin sensitivity. And these phytonutrients have also been shown to help regenerate the pancreatic beta cells. So these are the cells that produce insulin. So that is obviously very important and something that you want to occur. And because it is whole foods and you're not eating processed foods, we're cutting out all those processed and refined carbohydrates, which I think everyone with type 2 diabetes should be avoiding or at least minimizing. They really are the devil. It's naturally high in fiber, so we're making sure that we're nourishing the gut microbiome, and we are favoring it in such a way that you're not going to just absorb all the glucose and fat at once. Your body is able to manage it much better. It also is very helpful for weight loss, partly to do with the fiber. In terms of, in comparison with the low carb keto diet and then the low saturated fat whole food plant-based diet, they both will lead to a similar amount of weight loss after a period of time. It's just people with on the keto diet tend to lose a lot of weight initially, so they see results in a shorter period of time. But when you're consuming whole foods, it's hard to overconsume them. So you end up feeling full on slightly less calories, and you end up losing weight on it. And for both diets, you will lose the same amount of fat off your liver. So over time, they're both equal in terms of getting rid of the fat around the liver. And the whole food plant-based diet as well, because it is low in animal products, it is also low in these environmental chemicals. So that is, I guess, the alternative. So if you think about it, you've got your carbs, glucose and carbs, and then you've got your fat. So if you're eating a diet that is low in one or the other, then it's going to be more beneficial for you, and your body is going to be able to handle it a bit better metabolically. So you're going to be able to switch between the fuel sources if you're not overdoing both carbohydrates and fats. But if you are sticking to just a keto diet, then you're really promoting just the fat from being burnt, and you can become more metabolically inflexible. But really, you're going to see good results whether you choose one or the other. I just personally think that for most people, for the long term, a low-fat, whole-food, plant-based diet is the way to go. Now, I'm not totally against a low-carb diet, but I do think that there are certain people that would benefit more, and I have a few tips for you if you are wanting to do it. So I think that there is a role for keto low carb diet for people who are wanting and needing to lose a lot of weight. So you can still lose weight on a whole food plant-based diet, a low fat whole food plant-based diet, but for some people, particularly at the beginning where you have really insatiable appetites and you find it hard to stop eating, the low carb keto diet can be helpful because of that appetite suppression, and people seem to be able to do it a lot easier. So I think that the low carb keto diet is a good tool for weight loss, but I don't think it's the best solution for the long term when we're talking about weight loss, because at the end of the day, you're losing weight because you're eating less calories. So essentially it is a low calorie diet. And if you are on a low calorie diet over a long period of time, you can negatively affect your metabolism. So your body actually becomes efficient at burning less calories, which means that, if you were to start eating slightly more food, you might start gaining the weight again. So we still have that problem that we've always had with calorie restricted diets. So it is, I think, a really good tool for weight loss, but I don't think that it should be something that you rely on for the long term. Okay, that's one caveat. That one type of person that I think it would be appropriate for. And then the other type I think it would be appropriate for is for people who have had type 2 diabetes for a really long period of time. I say 10 years, but that's not really a long period of time, but if you've had it for 10 or more years and there's clearly irreversible damage to your pancreas and you're just not able to produce enough insulin yourself, so you're not able to tolerate carbohydrates very well, and your blood sugars are hard to manage because of that, then I think there is a role for at least a low carbohydrate diet in these people. I think everyone with type 2 diabetes shouldn't go overboard on carbohydrates because they are so vulnerable to the effects of over-consuming carbohydrates. But not all carbohydrates are created equal. And when you start treating the root causes of insulin resistance, if you haven't had diabetes for a long period of time and you don't have irreversible damage to your pancreas, then you can improve your insulin sensitivity, and you can get rid of this fat, you can improve your insulin sensitivity, and you can tolerate carbohydrates, and you can still eat all this, variety of really healthy foods that contain carbohydrates. And when we're talking about the gut microbiome again, what's really important is variety, and just generally for your overall health, eating a big variety of different foods, particularly plant-based foods, is what is so important. So we don't want to restrict your diet down so much that you are living off just a few different types of food. And I guess that's the issue long term as well with a keto diet, is that you really are restricted and you're eventually going to get sick of eating the same foods. So they are the two people I think a low carb diet is most suitable for when we're talking low carb keto. But as I said, low carb can also be a spectrum. So the more extreme end is when it's 30 to 50 grams a day. That is more your keto diet. Low carb can then be anywhere from 50 to 120 or 150 grams a day. So it's really quite a broad spectrum. I think most people with type 2 diabetes, you don't want to go too much over that 120, 150 grams of carbohydrates a day. You don't want to go too far over that. So we still want to keep it in the relatively low, moderate carbohydrate range. But you don't necessarily have to be really restrictive if you don't fall under those two categories. Now, if you are wanting to do a keto diet or more of the extreme low carbohydrate diet, I have just a few tips for you if you are going that way, or if you decide that you want to stick with this for the long term. These are a few tips. So oops. So number one is I would recommend to cycle. So if you are choosing to do low carb keto diet, particularly if it's for weight loss, I would suggest cycling, and that might mean doing it for 2 weeks, or it might mean doing it for 3 months, depending on what sort of results you're looking for, how much weight you have to lose and that sort of thing. But you can experiment. But I think the cycling is important because then your body's not getting used to this. You're not just calorie restricting for a long period of time, so you're less likely to negatively affect your metabolism, which means that, how quickly you burn energy. And it also means that you can still introduce the carbohydrates back. You can make sure that you stay metabolically flexible, so you're able to flip between the two fuel sources when you need to, and you're still getting a variety of different foods. You're getting enough fiber and so forth. So I would suggest cycling, and if you are cycling, you could be doing a low carb keto diet for a period of time. And if you wanted to throw some intermittent fasting in there, it's a little bit easier to do a stint of fasting after you've been on a low carb keto diet, because your appetite is already suppressed. So you're going to feel less hungry. So I'd recommend cycling. And to minimize your consumption of animal products and saturated fats for the reasons that we have talked about. And that does mean that the foods that you can eat, if you're going, really keto diet, if you're going really keto, then it does limit what you can eat to, things like nuts and seeds, avocado, extra virgin olive oil, and then all your really non-starchy veggies like your greens and your cruciferous vegetables and things like that. Then number 3 would be just what I've said. Eat mostly unsaturated fat. So eating mostly unsaturated fat because, well, they have more anti-inflammatory effects in the body, and so unsaturated fats, as I said, nuts and seeds, avocado, extra virgin olive oil, they are all really good at reducing inflammation. They are less likely to be stored in cells and more likely to be used for structures, cell structures and hormones and other things, and less likely to be damaging in the long term in terms of your cholesterol and so forth. So the unsaturated fats are the ones you want to be focusing in on. And lucky last, try and get as much fiber in as possible. And that doesn't mean having fiber supplements. It means trying to eat foods to get as much fiber in as possible. So really the fiber, you'd be getting most of your fiber from nuts and seeds and from avocado, and then all your non-starchy vegetables. So if you are going to do a keto low carb diet, I would highly recommend following just those 4 tips there, and just being mindful of, you know, the overconsumption of animal products in that kind of setting, and what your alternative is. Now, when you do go low carb or keto for a period of time, if you are cycling, when you start to introduce carbohydrates back in, you'll need to do it slowly, because you probably are going to be more insulin resistant. So you just need to slowly introduce them back and back off the amount of fat that you're having, and you'll be able to tolerate them a bit better. And if you've been able to lose a lot of weight, a lot of fat, and you've been able to get a lot of fat off your organs and out of your cells, then you will probably be you might come back a bit sooner. So it might take a week even to improve your glucose tolerance, but yeah, it's going to be very individualized. Okay, so that is about it. It's a big topic, a lot to take in, but I think it is really important that everyone understands what is on the table, and I think it's best to be informed and to not get too caught up in these fads. There is a role, it can be useful, but you just need to understand what the implications are and what else you're bringing into the picture when you are doing a low carb keto diet, and what things that you need to be mindful of. So I hope this has been helpful, and I hope that you have got something out of it. If you have, please make sure that you like and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on other upcoming videos. Share it with your friends and family if you think that they might find it helpful or useful as well. And make sure you subscribe to my channel. Okay, the other thing I just wanted to add is I have also got an online program. So if you are really serious and keen to beat type 2 diabetes, you really want answers and you want to understand it better so that you feel confident that you're doing the right thing, this program may be for you. So yeah, if that is you, please make sure you book in a consultation with either myself or one of my team to see if it's going to be appropriate for you. Okay, thank you.